welcome to the Chai Center and welcome to the Chai Academy. Over the past few days, we have been discussing modern day Israel, some interesting history, and of how basically Israel came about and the players, etc. Um, I will tell you that I've been giving it like some thought this morning. Is that there are many hidden miracles, and we discussed one yesterday. We discussed one that when the UN voted, the 50 or so members of the UN voted to give Israel, the Jews, a part of Palestine. Um, the Soviet Union were the staunchest advocates for this to happen, right? Granted, they wanted to get England, the Great Britain, out of the Middle East, but they also so that was their motive. That was their motive. However, who cares what the motive is? The bottom line is it's amazing. The Soviet Union, and and um, and and so that's one miracle, hidden miracle. The other, and there's others. I think we'll discuss one or two of them today, but it's nothing short of amazing. I'll tell you one miracle that comes to mind is that FDR, right? As far as go down in history, is he turned a blind eye to the plight of the Jews in the Holocaust, right? He wasn't sympathetic at all. But you get Truman. Truman was, and at a critical time, Truman took over. I guess FDR passed, so Truman took over, and look what happened, as we'll see. So there's so many things that happened to make it happen. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So it was May 14th. Remember, there was already the partition in 1947. November 29th, the UN voted a majority, 2/3 voted to allow the Jews to come back to Palestine, and they gave them 5,500 square miles that they had to share. 538,000 Jews had to share it with 390,007 Muslims, Arabs, etc. And they came back. May 14th, 1948. So we're looking at about 6 months later. At 8 a.m., the British rule of Palestine ended. So at 8 a.m., the Union Jacks, the English flag, was lowered. And a couple of hours later, before, and this is so important, before Ben Gurion declared independence and a statehood, before that happened, because he declared statehood, I think it was like 4 p.m. So this was about 10:11 a.m. So Britain, they ended their rule at 8. 2-3 hours later, a war began. And 6 countries started to attack Palestine, modern day Palestine, where the Jews were, and even if it wasn't given to them, they still attacked that. So by the time Ben Gurion made his speech at 4 p.m., actually the Jews in Jerusalem, or the non-Jews in Jerusalem for that matter, couldn't hear it because the siege had cut the electric off in Jerusalem. So people didn't even hear his speech. Right? So before independence, as soon as the Brits said we're done, they declared war. It didn't even give Ben Gurion a chance. Now they knew it was happening because Ben Gurion was very vocal that it is going to happen. Ben Gurion basically laid out in his speech that Israel, that Palestine which is now the name we're going to be giving it, is Israel. There was a big war, by the way. Should they call it the land of Israel, Medinat Israel? Should they call it Eretz Israel? Should they call it the land of Judah, Eretz Yehudah? So there was different discussions, but he said, we're going to call it Israel, the land of Israel, the state of Israel, I'm sorry. And he says, and from here, the Bible was given to the world. He said, and he thanks, that it's due to the perseverance of the Jews' loyalty to the land, because as we discussed yesterday, there were Jews living in perpetuity. I'm sorry, that was from the time they got in, from the time they came in under Joshua, just past Moses, there have been Jews living in the land of Israel, Canaan, Palestine, whatever you want to call it. So he says, so throughout the years there have been Jews, and he complimented the settlers from 100 years ago that came in and started to, dry the swamps and fight malaria and make it inhabitable. Right? And then he said something which has been a truism until this day, probably the most important reason. This is the reason why all good, moral, upstanding people have to support Israel. He said, "En a raison d'être," right? The reason for our existence is to provide a homeland for the Jewish people and allow any Jew to immigrate from anywhere, right? Which that is vital to our existence. You see, 3 years earlier, by the war, by the Holocaust, which ended in 1945, as we discussed, there was nowhere for the Jews to go, and even they got to 12 miles and they bombarded the ship. They tried to get to Israel. They were sent to Cyprus. Then they were sent back to France. They were sent back to Germany, and some terrible, disgusting things happened to the Jewish people. Now Ben Gurion said, "It's done. That's over. That's the ace up our sleeve. That is what we have. We have a land that every Jew is welcome here." Right? It was called the law of return. Any Jew who wants to live in Israel can live in Israel. You don't have to. They don't have to approve you. Of course, you have to get. If you're going to sign up, you have to do it right. But you have a right to live in Israel, and that's part of the Constitution. That every Jew has a right, and that's a game changer. In that respect, the Holocaust can't happen again, just for that reason alone. Now, could the Holocaust happen again otherwise? I believe so, but the dynamics have changed. We have a place to go. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. Where do we go? Israel. So the law of return is probably the most important line in his speech, and it's a line of the Constitution. He also said that this country will be founded on liberty, justice, and peace for all, based on the writings of the holy prophets, which was interesting in itself. He says the non-Jews are also welcome, and we guarantee of sanctity, and they have freedom of conscience. So they could worship as they wish. So this is really, if you think about it, this is such a democracy. You're allowed to just, you're just allowed to be who you are in Israel, and that's proven until today. Now, granted, they're fallible, because Israel does have a little bit of a racist problem when it comes to Ethiopian Jews. There's a lot of discord, and people resent some people, not the people. Some people resent, and there have been some problems, and so realize that even though they welcomed the Ethiopian Jews, and they welcomed the Falashans, and they welcomed Operation Solomon, the Magic Carpet, and Jews from all over are brought in. That's part of the Constitution, but they do err sometimes, and sometimes it's not the government, it's some people in some cities. You're gonna have it. you're going to have it. Especially when there's a housing crunch, you're going to have, it doesn't make it right. Now, it's interesting. In the Constitution and in Ben Gurion's speech, which is he read the Constitution, there was absolutely no mention of God whatsoever. Right? And that's because there was an argument. The secular Jews, basically they were communists. They said, we don't, this is nothing to do with God. We don't want God at all. We don't even believe in God. Now it's funny, they're coming to Israel, which they're coming because it's a Jewish homeland. How do you know it's a Jewish homeland? It's mentioned in the Bible, because if you take away the Bible, then just go to Hong Kong. Why come to Israel? So it's interesting that they put up that fight. The religious Jews said, hey, come on. There's no mention of God whatsoever in the Constitution. And they were peeved. So it took, I don't remember who it was, but it took a Solomonic wisdom of somebody who said, okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to come to a compromise. We're going to mention the rock of Israel, Tzur Yisrael. And Tzur Yisrael is basically, we say it in our prayers that God is the rock of Israel. But it doesn't say God, it just says Tzur Yisrael. So the religious Jews view Tzur Yisrael as God. The non-religious Jews figure the rock of Israel is, I don't know, God knows what, who knows what a rock, I don't know. Maybe a diamond. I have no idea but that was the fight. It's interesting. So the Holy Land of Israel, in this country, United States, there's God, right? God bless America, etc. You don't have that in Israel because of the, we're stubborn, stiff-necked people, and we'll even fight over whether God could be mentioned in Israel. It's to prove you were tough, by the way. I don't know if you know this, but cherry tomatoes were invented in Israel. And Moshe Dayan, right, when he wasn't fighting wars, he was growing cherry tomatoes. Now, the cherry tomatoes he grew, right, were very hard. The tomatoes themselves were very hard. So whenever somebody ate a hard tomato, they said, I bought Moshe's. I bought Moshe Dayan's tomatoes. So they we're just the cynic people. Now, it had ramifications, because when the poet wrote the song Hatikva, he wrote it first, and the music was added later by someone else. But Hatikva, there's no mention of God either. And because there's no mention of God, there are plenty of people who refuse to sing it, because it's untenable that the Israel national anthem of the Jewish people should not have God. So that is one of the reasons why Hatikva, you can go to a Jewish affair, and a lot of people will be singing it, and there will be others who won't be saying it, because they're upset that God wasn't put into the national anthem. So and it hurts some people to this very day. So he made that speech. Now, thankfully, as we started to say earlier, we had, when this was happening, we had Harry Truman as president. Because if Roosevelt was president, chances are it never would have happened, right? I don't know when Hatikva was actually written, but it was adopted in 1948, and it was adopted even before that. I think it was adopted at the Zionist Congress, actually, of some time. It wasn't written for, but it was written as a precursor. So Roosevelt died, right? And Harry Truman took over, and Harry Truman supported the UN and the partition plan in 1947, November of 47. President Truman supported the independence, and he bucked many anti-Zionists, including the Pentagon and the State Department, who were all anti-Zionist and did not want Israel to have its own. He didn't want Israel to gain any independence because they were fearful of, which is pretty much nothing has changed. Well, something has changed recently. They're fearful of Arab backlash, right? And what would they do? What will OPEC do to the oil? And what would the Arabs say? And what would this say and that say? But Truman bucked it, and he withstood the pressure, and he said, okay, we are, we are going to support this. He received an incredible amount of pressure. So he reached a point ad nauseum where the pressure was ad nauseum. He says, you know what? He will no longer talk about it. It's done. He's not interested in getting involved anymore in the Israel Zionist cause. He's done what he's done. Chaim Weizmann, the first president, the major Zionist after Herzl, flew to the United States to meet with President Truman. But Truman said, I am not meeting, anything to do. I don't want anything anymore to do with, to talk about Zionism. I've done my part, it's done. So Zionists, pro-Zionists, approached the president's very good friend. His name was Eddie Jacobson. Eddie Jacobson was a businessman. And by the way, Truman, one of the reasons they say that Truman supported was not totally altruistic is he wanted the Jewish vote in 1948 by the elections, just as a. But anyway, after the elections, he was voted in, and he said, I don't want to hear anything. So Weizmann came, and he wasn't given a visit, an audience by President Truman. So the Zionists contacted Eddie Jacobson, who was a good buddy, and he was a businessman, he's a wealthy man, and Eddie made an appointment to see the president. So when the appointment was being made, Eddie Jacobson and President Truman got on the phone, and he says, nothing. Don't talk to me about the Middle East. Don't talk to me about Zionism. Not interested. I'm sorry. No Middle East talk whatsoever. So the great day came, and Eddie came in, shook his hand, sat down, and started to cry. And Truman said, no. We had a deal. We had a deal. Can you hold by the deal or not? So Eddie Jacobs said, yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. President, I'm sorry. It hurts so much what's going on, but I'm and they discussed many, many things. Every so often, though, Eddie started to cry. Right? He cried. And tears fell from his eyes. So finally, the president got angry. And he says, you SOB, I should kick you out of my office. Right? We had a deal, but I can't stand to see you crying. Right? So he says, I can't see you cry. What do you want? He goes, I want you to meet with Weizmann. Right? The people are hurting. You need to hear firsthand. So he agreed, and he met Weizmann. Weizmann came, and he backed Israel. He changed his tune, and after the meeting with Weizmann, in 1949, the chief rabbi of Israel flew. And by the way, this story is told by Truman himself to a reporter, to a journalist. Merle, I think his name is. I don't remember fully. If anybody knows, you can. I think his name was Merle Miller or Merle, something like that. The chief rabbi came to him, and he told him as this, and he says, and Truman cried. He said to him that it was destined by God that your mother's womb should be filled by you, the person who allowed Jews to be saved and for Israel to be born. So they say that Truman, when he reflected on the story of meeting Weizmann and meeting the chief rabbi, so Merle, is it Milton Merle? I don't remember. it's recorded that he actually cried. He actually cried when he reflected back on it. Now, in an effort to be fair, there was a U.S. embargo on the warring parties. So the U.S. would not sell any weapons to Jews or Arabs in the Middle East. He says we are, we're not going to back either side, and we're not going to help either side, and neither side can buy weapons. Now here's the problem: Israel literally had nothing. They had nothing. It's a new country, right? They had, as we said yesterday, they had a couple of pickup trucks with sheet metal covered, and they had a few rounds of ammunition and a couple of rifles. They really didn't have much, right? I think they had one tank for every 60 they had, something like that. And so there was a U.S. embargo, which really, really hurt Israel. But here's where the other miracle occurred, right? So the Arabs were getting supported by many places, even the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union still support the Arab land. But that particular time in 1948, Joseph Stalin, who was a mass murderer, anti-Semite, a nut job, and somebody who should have been locked up in a facility, he allowed, and this is what I'm talking about, hidden miracles. He gave permission for Israel to buy munitions from Czechoslovakia, which was part of the Soviet Union. So he allowed them to. Stalin, we're talking about the Stalin who was just a very sick puppy, right? Stalin, I think it was Stalin who actually killed. Didn't he kill? Who did he kill? Rasputin. He killed him. He killed somebody in Mexico. Was it Trotsky? He was just a wild man. But he killed Rasputin. He killed. This guy was just out, But he allowed, all of a sudden, he had some moral clarity, and some vision that allowed Israel to buy from Czechoslovakia. And as they say, the rest is history. So once again, and it's written, by the way, it's written that if Roosevelt would have been president, chances are independence would not have happened. Or if it did happen, it would have been much, however tough it would have been much tougher. So we see the hand of God, right? We see the hand of God, that God is just amazing in little different ways. Right, Truman was the right man for the right time. Stalin, right decision for the right. Every other decision was poor. Right, and he made a good decision, and on and on and on and on and on. The fact that the Arabs didn't accept the partition, allowed Israel to be the size it is today, which is not big, but bigger than they gave it. So Lenny writes about there was some GIs that diverted military equipment. I do know that there were plenty in the private. I don't know about GIs, but there were probably, but I know that there were many private civilians or former veterans, former soldiers who managed to fly private planes, and they it's a famous story. There was three small planes, fighter planes. They're old, and they ripped it. They only had the pilot seat. Everything else was ripped out, and it was gasoline. And because you can't fly a small plane like this all across Atlantic. But they did. They filled up the entire cavity, aside from where the pilot was sitting. And they flew it to Israel so they can have at least 3 planes that they could and they used to smuggle in guns. Yeah, what they used to do is they used to steal from the U.S. Armory. They used to steal equipment and smuggle it into Israel. So whether it was done by civilians or done by GIs, who knows? People do know, but it's just the fact that we're still here, right? If Israel could survive its first year, it literally can survive anything, and I think that's the message. It was meant to be, and something that's meant to be, I don't think you mess with it. There's no reason for it. All right. Any questions? Can be if anybody knows the name of the reporter, the journalist. He died pretty young. I think he died in his 60s. But if anybody knows the name, that would be great if you can post it here so we can research him. Merle comes to mind, Merle, but I just not sure of that. Any questions, Rabbi at the Chai Center? You can also ask a question here. Of course, feel free to check out thechaicenter.com/academy. Be well.